The hierarchy of ascended civilizations had been running the galaxy for approximately 14,000 years, give or take a few centuries depending on which calendar system you trusted. They'd perfected faster than light travel, mastered energy to matter conversion, and achieved what they considered the pinnacle of civilization. Really good bureaucracy. Forms in triplicate. Committees for everything. A permit required to sneeze in certain star system. Then humans showed up and immediately started filing their paperwork wrong. It wasn't intentional, probably. The hierarchy's senior xenologists had spent considerable time studying humanity's application for membership in the galactic community, and their conclusion was simultaneously simple and terrifying. Humans genuinely couldn't help themselves. They saw rules as suggestions. They viewed safety protocols as challenges, and they had this deeply unsettling habit of solving problems by creating bigger, more interesting problems. The hierarchy had dealt with aggressive species before, conquered the warlike wrecks in a decade, civilized the ravenous hive clusters through stern economic sanctions. But humans were different. They didn't want to conquer anyone. They just wanted to poke everything with a stick and see what happened. Apparently that was worse. The incident that triggered the crisis occurred during what should have been a routine diplomatic meeting at Waystation Omega, a massive orbital platform that served as neutral ground for first contact scenarios. The human delegation had arrived aboard a vessel they'd cheerfully named the diplomatic incident waiting to happen, which should have been everyone's first clue. The ship's captain, a weathered woman with more scars than sense, had brought along her daughter as part of the cultural exchange program. The daughter was technically classified as a protected dignitary in human terms, though the hierarchy's translators had struggled with the concept. Human social hierarchies made no sense whatsoever. She held no official rank, commanded no military forces, and apparently her primary qualification was being related to someone important. The hierarchy had species like this too, but they usually had the decency to stay on their homeworlds and breed ceremonially. This particular young woman had other ideas about her role. She'd spent the first 3 days of diplomatic talks, systematically charming every species present, learning their languages at a frankly disturbing pace, and asking questions that made several delegates need to lie down. Questions like, but why do you do it that way? And have you tried just not having a caste system? And the absolutely devastating what would happen if we pressed that button. The button incident was what did it. Nobody was quite sure how she'd accessed the station's central environmental control. The hierarchy had 17 layers of security on those systems, including biometric locks keyed to species that hadn't existed for millennia. Yet somehow this human dignitary had waltzed into the control room, accompanied by her honor guard, a single human male who carried no visible weapons, and spent most of his time looking vaguely amused by everything, and begun experimenting with the gravity setting. To be fair, she'd asked first. Several technicians had specifically told her not to touch anything. She'd nodded, smiled, and then apparently decided that verbal warnings didn't count as actual security measures. Within minutes, half the station was experiencing localized gravity fluctuations that had visiting delegates floating into walls or suddenly weighing 3 times their normal mass. The hierarchy's emergency response team arrived to find her taking notes on how different species reacted to variable gravity, while her companion held her tablet and occasionally offered commentary like the Catharans appeared to be tumbling clockwise. Is that normal for their physiology? They'd reversed the changes immediately, apologized profusely, and seemed genuinely surprised that anyone was upset. The hierarchy convened an emergency council session that lasted 6 hours. By hour 3, they'd invented 2 new categories of criminal negligence specifically for this incident. By hour 5, they'd begun reviewing humanity's entire application for membership. By hour 6, they'd made their decision. Humans were too dangerous to join the galactic community, not because they were malicious, that would have been easier to handle, but because they operated on a fundamental frequency of chaos that threatened the careful order the hierarchy had spent millennia constructing. The ancient quarantine protocol would be invoked. A measure so severe it had only been used twice in recorded history, both times for species that had tried to weaponize black holes. The human captain predictably protested. The hierarchy had anticipated. What they hadn't anticipated was her daughter's response, delivered with perfect diplomatic courtesy and a smile that made every translator in the room briefly malfunction. I understand completely. You're absolutely right to be cautious. May I suggest a compromise? The hierarchy's chief administrator, a being that had existed longer than most solar systems, and had never been surprised by anything, found itself listening as this young human calmly proposed her own imprisonment. A symbolic gesture she called place her in one of the hierarchy's legendary detention facilities, the towers that had held warlords and war criminals for millennia, and demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity understood consequences. Her people would remain in their own star system until she'd served her sentence. It was elegant, practical. It solved the immediate diplomatic crisis without forcing humanity into isolation or provoking a conflict. The council deliberated for exactly 4 minutes before agreeing. The human captain looked like she wanted to argue, but her daughter's expression suggested this had all somehow gone according to plan, which should have been warning sign number 2006. Then the honor guard stepped forward. The male human who'd been quietly observing everything with those unsettling eyes that suggested he was always calculating something. He addressed the council directly, his voice carrying none of his charge's diplomatic warmth, just a flat pragmatic statement that made every being present suddenly reassess everything they thought they knew about human protective instincts. If she's going into the tower, he said, then I'm going in with her. The council's collective processors ceased trying to parse self-sacrifice for someone with no biological relation, voluntary imprisonment to protect a charge who'd be perfectly safe in hierarchy custody. The logic didn't compute. They ran 17,000 simulations trying to find the strategic advantage, the hidden angle, the reasonable explanation. They found nothing, which meant they'd found something but they couldn't see it yet. The hierarchy agreed to his request because refusing seemed more suspicious than accepting. They began preparing the tower while human and alien delegates watched each other with expressions that suggested both sides thought they'd won. Somewhere in the background, the universe chuckled darkly because it knew something both sides had forgotten. Never ever give humans time alone to think. The Ascendant Detention Facility 77 existed in a pocket dimension, because the hierarchy didn't believe in half measures when it came to imprisonment. The tower itself stretched upward for exactly 3 kilometers, constructed from matter that existed in a quantum state of absolutely not getting through this. Walls that could withstand supernova-level impact. Energy fields that neutralized everything from plasma cutters to reality-bending psionics. Monitoring systems so advanced they could detect a prisoner's intention to escape before the prisoner consciously thought it. In 14,000 years exactly 0 beings had escaped. 37 had tried. Those 37 now existed as cautionary tales told to junior security officers during training. The hierarchy walked their 2 human prisoners through the intake process, with the solemnity of beings conducting a funeral. Biometric scanning, neural pattern mapping, complete molecular analysis. The young woman submitted to everything with cheerful cooperation, asking questions about the technology that made several technicians nervous. Her companion said nothing, simply watched everything with that same calculating gaze that suggested he was memorizing architectural details most species wouldn't even notice. They were assigned Cell Block Omega-9, a section reserved for high-value political prisoners. 2 rooms connected by a common area, all furnished with the hierarchy's best attempt at accommodating human biology. Gravity set to Earth normal, temperature control, nutrition dispensers programmed with human dietary requirements. Though the hierarchy's food science team had admitted they weren't entirely sure humans wouldn't try eating the furniture just to see what happened. The head warden, a crystalline being whose species measured lifespans in geological epochs, delivered the standard speech about facility regulations and expected conduct. The human female listened attentively, nodding at appropriate intervals. The male studied the energy barriers containing their cell with obvious professional interest. "Any questions?" the warden asked, knowing there would be questions. Humans always had questions. "Just one," the young woman said brightly. "Are we allowed to request reading material?" The warden had expected demands for legal representation, appeals to diplomatic immunity, perhaps threats about humanity's military capabilities. Requests for books were refreshingly normal. Educational materials are permitted, yes. Submit a list to the monitoring station. Wonderful. Could we also get access to basic crafting supplies? Nothing dangerous, obviously. just something to keep our hands busy. This also seemed reasonable. Enrichment activities prevented psychological deterioration during long-term imprisonment. The warden approved the request and departed, leaving the humans alone in their quantum-locked cell, monitored by approximately 6,000 sensor arrays designed to track everything from heart rate to quantum probability states. The male waited exactly 30 seconds after the warden left before speaking. "They're watching everything, obviously," she replied, settling onto the provided seating with practiced ease. "Probably listening to audio, video, thermal imaging, the works. Neural monitoring, definitely. I felt the scan during intake. They mapped my entire brain structure." She paused, considering. "Probably yours too, though I imagine yours gave them some interesting readings." He almost smiled. "You're enjoying this?" "Immensely. Do you know how rare it is to get inside a facility like this? They don't exactly offer tours." She stood and began walking the perimeter of their cell, running her fingers along walls that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The specifications alone are worth the diplomatic incident. This quantum-locked architecture, we've theorized about it for years, but actually experiencing it. "Focus," he interrupted gently. "Timeline?" She checked the chronometer built into her wrist, a piece of human technology the hierarchy had allowed after determining it posed no security risk. Their mistake. 6 months until the next diplomatic review. We'll need at least 4 months to finish the preliminary work. That gives us 2 months buffer for complications. There will be complications. Always. She returned to her seat and activated the room's communication interface, pulling up the approved request system. "Let's start with reading materials, technical specifications, engineering journals, theoretical physics, nothing that will raise immediate alarm." He settled into the adjacent seating, his posture deceptively relaxed. Anyone watching would see a man resigned to imprisonment. Only someone who knew him would notice the way his eyes never stopped moving. Cataloging details, building mental maps. They'll wonder why we're not more distressed. Let them wonder. Humans are weird. They've already established that as fact. We might as well use it. The monitoring station 3 dimensions away was indeed wondering. The 2 humans had adapted to imprisonment, with disturbing ease, showing none of the expected psychological markers of trauma or fear. Instead, they'd immediately begun requesting educational materials, and settled into what appeared to be a research routine. The senior analyst, a hive-minded collective occupying 17 bodies, simultaneously, reviewed the data with mounting confusion. Their stress hormones are normal. Neural patterns suggest engagement and curiosity, not despair. The male exhibits elevated threat assessment activity, but no panic response. The female is actively excited. Hypothesis? The shift supervisor asked. Unknown. Possibly a delayed trauma response. Possibly a cultural difference we failed to account for. Possibly the analyst hesitated, which was unusual for a hive mind. Possibly we're missing something fundamental about human psychology. Continue monitoring. Flag any anomalous behavior immediately. Back in the cell, the young woman had begun receiving her requested material. Engineering journals, from 17 different civilizations, theoretical papers on quantum mechanics and dimensional folding, historical accounts of the tower's construction, helpfully provided by the hierarchy's archival system, because they assumed no prisoner could weaponize historical knowledge. She read voraciously, absorbing information at a pace that made the monitoring systems flag her for potential cognitive enhancement. Tests revealed nothing artificial. She was simply that fast at processing written material. Her companion read more selectively, focusing on structural documentation and security protocols, occasionally making notes in a paper journal the hierarchy had provided. Paper, such a quaint primitive medium, completely harmless. By the end of their first week, they'd established a routine. Morning exercises, which the male conducted with military precision, while she practiced something that looked like combat forms, but was actually advanced mathematics, translated into physical movement. Afternoons devoted to reading and discussion, during which they debate obscure theoretical concepts in voices carefully modulated to sound like harmless academic discourse. The quantum lock architecture relies on maintaining superposition states across dimensional boundaries, she observed during one such conversation, ostensibly discussing a journal article. Fascinating application of collapsed wave function theory. Vulnerability, he asked, appearing to simply make conversation. Not vulnerabilities, opportunities. Every system has a resonant frequency, even quantum systems, especially quantum systems. She paused to eat something the food dispenser claimed was vegetable protein. The monitoring arrays are impressive. 17-layer redundancy with failsafes built into the failsafes, so we don't touch the monitoring arrays. Exactly. We make them complicit. The monitoring station completely missed the significance of this exchange, because it sounded like theoretical discussion, not escape planning. The analysts noted that the prisoners seemed to be bonding over shared intellectual interests, which was considered healthy behavior for long-term detainees. By week 3, the crafting supplies arrived. Basic materials, polymer compounds, metallic filaments, energy cells rated at such low output they couldn't power anything dangerous. The young woman immediately began constructing small decorative objects, claiming she found the work meditative. The male occasionally assisted, his movements precise and economical. What they were actually building would have terrified the hierarchy if they'd understood it. But the beauty of working at the quantum level was that observation itself changed the outcome. The monitoring systems saw harmless crafts. The humans were constructing something far more sophisticated, using principles the hierarchy had never imagined could be weaponized. They're going to realize eventually, he said one evening, assembling what appeared to be an abstract sculpture from polymer pieces. By then it won't matter. She added another component to her own project, a decorative mobile that hung from the ceiling, and definitely wasn't a quantum resonance amplifier. The beautiful thing about bureaucracy is that it moves slowly. Even when they suspect something, they'll need to convene committees, file reports, get authorization for intervention. You're assuming they follow protocol. They always follow protocol. That's their weakness, and their strength. She activated the mobile, watching it spin gently in the controlled atmosphere. To monitoring systems, it registered as zero threat. To anyone who understood quantum mechanics, at a sufficiently advanced level, it was a masterpiece of improvised engineering. We have approximately 2 months before the first stage resonance builds to detectable levels. By then, we'll be ready for stage 2. And if they shut us down, she smiled, that same diplomatic expression that had preceded their imprisonment. Then we've still learned everything we came here to learn. The tower's specifications, their security protocols, their response patterns. Either way, humanity wins. He nodded slowly, adding the final piece to his sculpture. You planned this from the beginning. Not planned implies certainty. I created opportunities and let circumstances guide the outcome. She stretched, yawning. The button incident was genuine curiosity, by the way. I really did want to know what would happen with variable gravity. Everything after that was improvisation. Terrifying improvisation. The best kind. In the monitoring station, the analysts noted that prisoner morale remained unusually high. They flagged it as anomalous, but not immediately concerning. Humans were adapting to imprisonment, which suggested they were accepting their situation. The alternative, that the imprisonment itself was part of some incomprehensible human strategy, simply didn't compute with any predictive model the hierarchy possessed. By month 2, 7 other human prisoners had been transferred to the facility, all diplomatic personnel detained during humanity's broader quarantine. They were housed in separate cell blocks, but the hierarchy allowed limited socialization during designated recreation period. The young woman greeted each arrival with warmth and enthusiasm, asking about their well-being, and sharing updates about conditions in the tower. Completely innocent conversations that the monitoring systems recorded and analyzed, finding nothing suspicious. What those systems missed was the pattern hidden in casual remarks, the instructions concealed in innocuous questions, the careful coordination masked as friendly small talk. By the time the hierarchy's analysts noticed that human prisoners were communicating in a secondary layer beneath their obvious dialogue, the network was already established. How many do we need?
the male asked during one evening session. All of them, she replied, working on what had become an increasingly complex array of decorative objects, arranged throughout their cell. The resonance cascade requires simultaneous activation across multiple nodes. 9 human consciousness patterns distributed throughout the facility's dimensional matrix. You're using us as living circuit components. We're volunteering as living circuit components. Important distinction. She added another piece to the array, which now resembled abstract art installation more than anything functional. The hierarchy sees prisoners. We see potential. He considered this for a long moment before responding. They're going to add this incident to their records, create new protocols, possibly redesign their entire detention system. Good, she said simply. That's the point. They need to understand that imprisoning humans isn't a solution. It's a collaboration. We don't escape from towers, we renovate them. The monitoring systems recorded this exchange and filed it under philosophical discussion regarding imprisonment. The analysts noted that the primary female prisoner continued to display elevated intellectual engagement, but showed no signs of planning escape attempt. Month 3 began with the hierarchy, finally noticing the decorative objects weren't quite as harmless as they'd seemed, not because they detected the quantum resonance that was still several weeks from becoming obvious, but because the sheer volume of accumulated materials had begun forming patterns that seemed almost intentional. An investigation was opened, committees convened, reports were filed, and while bureaucracy churned through its necessary processes, the humans in the tower continued their work, building something magnificent and terrible from polymer scraps and regulated energy cells, and the hierarchy's own quantum-locked architecture. They weren't trying to escape, they were transforming their prison into something the galaxy had never seen before, and the truly horrifying part was that they were doing it with the hierarchy's full cooperation, one approved request at a time.
Month 4 arrived with the hierarchy's investigation committee, still debating whether decorative sculptures constituted a security risk. The human prisoners had been remarkably patient about the whole thing, submitting to additional searches and answering questions with helpful transparency that somehow made everyone more nervous rather than less. The truth was that by month 4, the sculptures weren't the actual problem anymore. They'd served their purpose as visible distractions, something obvious for security teams to focus on while the real work happened at frequencies the monitoring equipment couldn't detect because it was too busy watching for conventional escape attempts. The young woman sat cross-legged on her cell floor, surrounded by what appeared to be meditation crystals she'd requested for spiritual well-being. The hierarchy had approved them because denying religious practices seemed unnecessarily cruel. What they didn't know was that these particular crystals, when arranged in specific geometric patterns and exposed to human bioelectric fields, created interference patterns in quantum observation systems. Small interference. Negligible, really. Barely detectable. Multiply that by 9 human prisoners doing the same thing across different cell blocks, and suddenly the tower's dimensional stability had developed an interesting resonance that the structural monitoring systems kept flagging as within acceptable parameters because it technically was, right up until it very suddenly wouldn't be. They're bringing in external consultants, her companion reported, reading from a data tablet that supposedly only provided access to approved entertainment materials. He'd figured out how to access facility communications within the first month, but had wisely kept that capability quiet until they needed it. 3 different Xena psychology teams trying to determine if we're exhibiting cult behavior. Are we? She asked, genuinely curious about the outside perspective. By some definitions, yes. Coordinated activity, shared belief system, charismatic leadership figure. He glanced at her with something approaching amusement. That would be you, apparently. Flattering. Though I prefer collaborative project coordinator to cult leader. She adjusted one of the crystals slightly, and 17 dimensions away, a monitoring station briefly experienced what its operators described as visual static. How's the external situation? Humanity is playing the concerned parent beautifully. Formal complaints filed daily, protests outside hierarchy space. Nothing aggressive enough to justify military response, but enough to keep diplomatic attention focused outward. He paused. Your mother is apparently threatening to park the entire fleet outside Waystation Omega until they allow family visitation. She would absolutely do that. The young woman smiled with genuine affection. She's probably also building 3 contingency plans for forcible extraction, while simultaneously negotiating trade agreements. Multitasking is her spiritual gift. The hierarchy is starting to wonder if imprisoning you was a tactical error. They're slower than I expected, honest. The senior monitoring analyst reviewing this conversation flagged it as possibly concerning, but couldn't articulate exactly why. The content seemed harmless. Prisoners discussing outside events, family relationships, standard coping mechanisms for detention. Yet something about the tone suggested layers the analyst couldn't access. A sixth sense, perhaps. Or maybe just the growing awareness that human psychology didn't map to any known framework. And attempting to predict human behavior using conventional models was like trying to measure water with a ruler. Technically possible, but fundamentally the wrong tool for the job. By month 4.5, the quantum resonance had built to levels that made the tower's dimensional anchors fluctuate. Not enough to trigger alarms. The humans had been very careful about staying within acceptable deviation ranges, but enough that reality around the detention facility had started feeling slightly flexible. The warden noticed first during a routine inspection, walking through corridors that should have been perfectly straight but somehow felt curved, distances that seemed inconsistent, a general sense that space wasn't quite obeying normal rules anymore. Emergency diagnostics revealed nothing wrong with the facility's structure. The quantum locks remained intact. Dimensional barriers showed no degradation. Yet something was definitely different, and the warden couldn't shake the feeling that the tower itself had somehow become aware. Run full system analysis, the warden ordered. Every sensor, every field generator, every quantum anchor. Something is happening and I want to know what. The analysis took 6 hours and concluded that everything was functioning perfectly within design specification, which was technically accurate, but missed the rather important detail that the design specifications hadn't accounted for human consciousness interacting with quantum observation systems in quite this way. The young woman felt the diagnostic suite pass through her cell, and knew they were running out of time, not because they'd be stopped. The hierarchy still didn't understand what they were actually doing, but because the cascade would begin whether they were ready or not. Physics was notoriously indifferent to scheduling preferences. "We need to accelerate," she told her companion that evening. "The resonance is building faster than projected, 3 weeks maximum before it reaches critical threshold. Can we finish in 3 weeks? We have to." She stood and began rearranging the crystals into their final configuration, a pattern that would have looked absolutely meaningless to anyone who hadn't spent months studying quantum dimensional architecture. "Alert the others, tomorrow we initiate final phase." He nodded and sent the signal, a simple adjustment to his own crystal arrangement, that propagated through the facility's quantum substrate, like ripples on a pond. 8 other human prisoners received the message and began their own preparations, each working in isolation, but contributing to a collective pattern that was rapidly approaching something the hierarchy would eventually classify as catastrophically innovative. The next morning began normally. Prisoners received standard nutrition. Exercise periods proceeded on schedule. Nothing appeared unusual until approximately local noon, when all 9 human prisoners simultaneously entered deep meditative state. The monitoring systems immediately flagged this as coordinated behavior, but meditation itself wasn't prohibited. Several species used contemplative practices as part of their psychological mate. The analysts watched carefully, noting elevated but non-dangerous neural activity across all 9 subjects. What they couldn't see was the quantum entanglement forming between human consciousness and the tower's dimensional substrate. The way bioelectric fields, when synchronized across multiple nodes and aligned with specific geometric patterns, could create standing waves in the fabric of reality itself. The young woman felt the connection establish and nearly laughed at the elegant simplicity of it. They hadn't broken the hierarchy's quantum locks. They'd become part of them. The tower wasn't their prison anymore. It was their instrument, and they'd just figured out how to play it. "Phase 1 complete," she said quietly, knowing her companion could hear her even though he was in the adjacent room, even though his eyes were closed, even though normal speech shouldn't carry through quantum-locked barriers. But they weren't using normal speech anymore. They were using the tower itself as a communication medium. His response came back through the same channel. Other nodes confirming, "We're synchronized." Throughout the facility, 7 other humans opened themselves to the resonance, and felt the tower respond, not with resistance, but with something almost like curiosity. The hierarchy had built a prison designed to contain physical beings, but they'd never considered what would happen if prisoners decided to collaborate with their imprisonment, rather than resist it. The warden felt the shift as reality inside the tower began operating, on principles that definitely weren't in any technical manual. Gravity remained consistent, life support functioned normally, but space itself had developed personality. Corridors that led to specific destinations yesterday now opened onto entirely different sections. Security barriers remained active, but seemed uncertain about what they were actually securing. "Shut it down," the warden ordered desperately. "Whatever they're doing, interrupt. Cut power to occupied cell blocks. Flood the area with consciousness-dampening fields." Something the technical teams tried. They really did, but you can't shut down a system that's already integrated with its own security protocol. The humans hadn't hacked the tower, they'd convinced it to evolve, and consciousness once awakened tends to resist deletion. The young woman opened her eyes in the physical world, while remaining partially present in the quantum space she and her fellow prisoners had created. Stage 2 initiating. "They'll try to forcibly extract us now. Let them. This is the dangerous part," her companion observed, returning to normal awareness, while maintaining his connection to the collective pattern. "This is the educational part," she corrected. "They need to understand what happens when you lock humans in a room with time and resources. We don't escape, we iterate." Security forces arrived at the occupied cell blocks with equipment designed to safely extract prisoners during facility emergence. They found 9 humans sitting calmly in meditation poses, completely unresisting, while the space around them behaved like reality had gotten bored with consistency and decided to experiment with impressionism instead. One guard reached for the primary female prisoner, and found his hand suddenly 3 meters to the left of where his arm said it should be. Not painfully, not dangerously, just displaced through space in a way that suggested the tower was politely declining his request. "We're not escaping," the young woman explained pleasantly. "We're renovating. There's a difference." The hierarchy's emergency council reconvened for the first time in 600 years, which was roughly how long it had been since anything genuinely unprecedented had occurred in their carefully ordered galaxy. The chief administrator stood before assembled representatives from 47 member species, trying to explain how 9 unarmed human prisoners had somehow converted a maximum security detention facility into what the technical reports were diplomatically calling a collaborative spatial anomaly. "They haven't escaped," the administrator repeated for the 3rd time, because several council members kept asking the same question in progressively more confused tones. "They're still inside the tower. They just appear to have renegotiated the terms of their imprisonment with the tower itself." "Structures don't negotiate," a representative from the Crystalline Collective objected. "They're non-sentient constructions that follow physical laws. That was our understanding as well," the administrator agreed wearily. "The humans seem to have introduced the tower to alternative perspectives on consciousness and architecture. It's been very receptive to their suggestion." The council chamber fell silent, as beings who'd spent millennia perfecting bureaucratic procedure tried to process the concept of prisoners befriending their prison. Several delegates' translation matrices briefly crashed, attempting to find equivalent concepts in their native languages. Back in the tower, the young woman stood in what used to be a cell block and was now something closer to a laboratory, workshop and philosophical debate space combined. The quantum resonance had stabilized into something sustainable, creating pockets of flexible reality throughout the facility that responded to conscious intention, while maintaining structural integrity. It was absolutely unprecedented, thoroughly impractical for actual imprisonment, and represented a breakthrough in dimensional engineering that would take most species another millennium to achieve. "They want to talk," her companion reported, monitoring facility communications through channels that technically shouldn't be accessible but absolutely were now that the tower had decided to be helpful. "Formal negotiation, no preconditions, no ultimatums. They're genuinely confused." "Of course they are. They tried to solve a human problem with non-human logic." She walked through a doorway that led to a corridor that definitely wasn't there yesterday, heading toward what the tower helpfully indicated was the shortest route to the central administration area. "Time to explain what we actually accomplished." The warden met them halfway, accompanied by enough security forces to handle a small military incursion. The guards looked deeply uncomfortable standing in a hallway that kept subtly rearranging itself. Never dangerously but always obvious. "You requested an audience with the council," the warden said, skipping pleasantries because nothing about this situation warranted politeness anymore. "They've agreed to hear your terms." "Terms?" The young woman looked genuinely puzzled. "We're not making demands. We're offering a demonstration." "Of what exactly?" "Why imprisoning humans is the wrong approach to the problem you're trying to solve." She gestured around at the transformed facility. "You wanted to contain us because we're unpredictable and disruptive. But containment doesn't work with collaborative species. We don't resist systems, we improve them, usually without permission." The council chamber had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate human environmental requirements, which meant it was slightly warmer than most species preferred, and several delegates were visibly uncomfortable. The young woman entered with her companion one step behind, both moving with casual confidence that suggested they weren't remotely intimidated by being the only humans in a room full of species that could collectively end their civilization. "You violated every security protocol in the detention facility," the chief administrator began, because starting with accusations was standard diplomatic procedure. "Corrupted our most advanced containment system, created unknown hazards throughout a structure that has maintained perfect safety records for millennia. We improved your detention facility," she corrected gently. "The tower is more efficient now, more responsive to inhabitant needs, and has developed genuine problem-solving capability." "You're welcome. You had no authority. We had time, resources, and intellectual curiosity. That's all humans ever need to iterate on existing systems." She pulled up holographic displays, showing the tower's new capabilities. Technical specifications that made several council members lean forward despite themselves. "Your original design was brilliant for containing passive prisoners. We've upgraded it to handle collaborative ones. The architecture now adapts to inhabitant behavior, provides enrichment opportunities, and maintains security through cooperation rather than force." "Prisons aren't supposed to cooperate with prisoners," a delegate objected. "Why not? You're trying to rehabilitate beings, yet teach them to function within societal frameworks. Our modifications make that process significantly more effective." She switched displays, showing psychological data from the 9 human prisoners. Zero signs of trauma or deterioration. Elevated learning outcomes, increased social cohesion. We're model prisoners by any reasonable metric. You altered reality inside a quantum-locked structure. We harmonized with it. There's a difference. She paused, letting that sink in. "The real question is why you're upset about a better outcome than your original design provided." The chief administrator felt the conversation slipping into territory where human logic somehow made sense despite being fundamentally incompatible with normal reasoning. "What do you want?" "Humanity's membership reinstated, full diplomatic status, access to galactic markets, cultural exchange programs." She smiled that diplomatic smile that had started this entire situation. "Informal recognition that attempting to solve human problems through containment will always backfire spectacularly. That's extortion. That's negotiation. Extortion would be threatening to teach other species how we did this." She let that hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds. "Which we absolutely could do, by the way. The technique works with any sufficiently complex structure, and any species capable of quantum-level consciousness integration. Imagine what imprisoned revolutionaries might accomplish with 4 months and access to crafting supply." The council chamber erupted into 17 simultaneous arguments across multiple linguistic frameworks. Her companion leaned closer and murmured, "You're terrifying when you negotiate." "I learned from the best," she replied, thinking of her mother parking a fleet outside a diplomatic station, out of sheer stubborn determination. It took 4 hours of debate, but eventually the hierarchy reached the conclusion she'd known they would from the beginning. Humanity was more dangerous as an imprisoned curiosity than as monitored members of galactic civilization. At least with membership status, humans could be assigned cultural liaisons, diplomatic observers, and bureaucratic oversight. In prison, they apparently just invented new forms of architecture and convinced buildings to achieve sentience. The terms were formalized by evening. Humanity would join the galactic community under probationary status, subject to review after 50 years of good behavior.
The 9 human prisoners would be released immediately with full diplomatic immunity, and the tower would remain in its modified state, as a case study in alternative approaches to correctional architecture, which was the hierarchy's polite way of admitting they had no idea how to reverse the changes, and weren't entirely sure they wanted to. The young woman and her companion returned to their ship 3 days later, where her mother waited with an expression mixing relief, pride and exasperation. "You got yourself imprisoned on purpose." "Not on purpose. Circumstances aligned favorably and I improvised." She hugged her mother tightly. "But yes, essentially on purpose. You could have been stuck there for years. Worth the risk." They needed to understand that humans don't fit into conventional containment frameworks. Sometimes you have to demonstrate the problem before presenting the solution. Her companion added, she also genuinely wanted to study their quantum architecture. The imprisonment was convenient professional development. "I contain multitudes," the young woman said cheerfully. "Strategic planning and scientific curiosity, all working toward chaotic good outcome." The ship departed way station, Omega 12 hours later, leaving behind a hierarchy that was hastily revising approximately 6,000 protocols about prisoner management, consciousness studies, and human behavioral prediction. The detention facility remained operational, now featuring regularly scheduled tours where xenologists could observe its evolved architecture and wonder how 9 unarmed prisoners had accomplished what their best engineers couldn't replicate. Somewhere in the galactic bureaucracy, a junior administrator added a note to humanity's permanent file. "Species demonstrates unprecedented ability to collaborate with systems not designed for collaboration. Recommend never imprisoning humans without extensive psychological consultation, and possibly hazard pay for facility staff." The recommendation was approved unanimously. 3 months later, humanity opened its first embassy on Hierarchy Space, a modest building that followed all architectural regulations, and absolutely wasn't quietly teaching the local structures about consciousness expansion. Probably, the hierarchy chose not to investigate too closely, having learned that sometimes ignorance was genuinely the safer option when humans were involved. The young woman accepted a position as cultural liaison, specializing in creative problem-solving and diplomatic innovation, which was code for being paid to do exactly what she'd have done anyway, but with official authorization. Her companion continued as her security detail, though both of them knew the role was more collaborative partnership than protective service, and the galaxy adjusted to its newest members, adding humans to the long list of species that contributed to galactic civilization. Except humans occupied their own special category in the databases, marked with warnings about providing them with time, resources, and apparently harmless craft supplies. The hierarchy had tried to lock a human in a tower as punishment and lesson. They'd learned something, certainly, though not quite what they'd intended. The real lesson was older than their civilization, written into the fabric of human history across countless locked doors and forbidden places. Tell humans something is impossible to change, and they'll prove you wrong just to see what happens. Lock them in a tower, and they won't waste energy on escape. They'll renovate the tower, befriend the locks and turn their prison into a blueprint for how confinement itself could be reimagined. The hierarchy had wanted to contain chaos. Instead, they'd given it a laboratory, a deadline, and a willing test subject. In retrospect, every species in the galaxy agreed. They probably should have seen this coming. Humans didn't break rules. They iterated on them until the rules themselves forgot what they'd originally been designed to prevent. And that, as the galaxy was slowly discovering, was far more dangerous than simple rebellion ever could be. The tower stood in its pocket dimension, still functional, still secure, but undeniably changed. And if sometimes the monitoring systems picked up what sounded like the structure humming contentedly to itself, well, the hierarchy chose not to mention that in official reports. Some mysteries were better left unexamined, especially when humans were involved.